Have you learned how to handle this way of living, always being close to a release of something that could be a success or a failure? I mean, how do you handle that pressure that?
Well, I hope that it's always that way. I mean, it's screenwriters in Hollywood tend to be a little bit like running backs in American football, where the careers don't usually last that long. So I don't know how long this will go on. It's much better being in a position where you have an imminent release than the other way, which is where you have no idea when the next movie is going to be made. But it's it's frightening. It's the advice you normally receive is that you should have a thick skin and you deal with the criticism and everything else. But the truth is, very few writers that I know have a thick skin, and I think most of us are actually kind of skinless, where you spend so much time working on something and it becomes so close to your heart, and the characters are so important to you, and the story is so important to you, and then if it's criticized, it's very painful, and that's just the way it is. And there's no point to kind of denying that, because sometimes you see, whether it's a writer or an actor or whatever, they say criticism doesn't bother me. I don't read the reviews. I don't care about the reviews. I never believe that. We all care. Like it's too important for all of us. But at the end of the day, again, it's like you're gonna take your hits, and hopefully you get there's some good feedback. Inevitably, there's going to be some bad feedback, and you just move on. And again, I think the important thing is that it not affect your writing, and that you can't write from a place of fear. You can't start writing thinking, well, God, the critics are really going to savage me if I try to do that, because then you're trying to answer all these different voices in your head, and it's just not I don't think it's not a very good way to go about it. So, it's these movies come out, and you hope for the best, and you kind of knock on wood, and what happens, happens.
Do you watch movies differently now that you write screenplays yourself?
Yes.
But
it's the sign of a very good movie when I forget about the screenplay, and I forget that I know more about how movies are made. And it still happens, with a really great movie. I get kind of lost in the world as I did when I was a child, and it's more and more rare, but it's also more and more gratifying when it happens, because it's so rare at this point. And my favorite movie last year was a Swedish movie, Let the Right One In, or the English title was Let the Right One In, which I thought was beautiful, and which I thought was should have been the Oscar nominee for Best Foreign Movie, but Sweden did not nominate it. But anyway, this is or a couple of years ago there was There Will Be Blood, the Paul Thomas Anderson movie, and the year before that, Lives of Others. I mean, it's like one a year at this point that I can sit in the theater and just completely forget that I'm a screenwriter, and that I know how these things are constructed, and it's a very, very happy experience when it happens.
I read somewhere in an interview that you said something about that you've understood the importance of story. That your first novels were not so story bound. They were they were more abstract, and I thought it was very interesting and sort of mature thing to say, that a lot of writers start out writing autobiographical notes, and then you become more and more interested in what you can use a story for. I mean, it would be interesting to hear you talk a little bit about that. How, in your eyes, what's a story useful for? I hope it's an understandable question.
Yeah, no, I think it is. I think that when I was a young writer, I had more of a not disdain, but I kind of thought that plot was and story was more something for genre fiction. It's like, it's fine for if you're writing a crime novel, if you're writing a horror story or something. But I thought of many of the great literary novels that I really enjoyed don't have particularly strong stories, and it didn't matter. I was much more interested in style and just the rhythm of an author's sentences and the characters. And I think at a certain point, and I'm not sure exactly when, I don't think there was any kind of like moment of revelation. It was just sort of a gradual process where I realized that the truth was, and especially I think the older I got, the stories that I really loved, or the novels that I really loved, really did have strong stories. And I think of Hemingway with For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is one of my favorite books, or Melville with Moby Dick, or or even like the older ones going back, even like the Shakespeare, there's always a great story, and there's always a narrative engine that's driving the story forward, and it's kind of like this an internal propulsion that's leading you forward. And without that, too many books I think start to feel like very self-indulgent to me, and ultimately a little bit empty, because the whole reason that we read, the whole reason I think that we enjoy fiction, whether it's in book form or a movie or whatever else it is that desire to hear a story told. And it's whether it's going back to ancient days where we were sitting around campfires listening to someone tell a story, it all goes back to the oral tradition, and those people telling stories thousands of years ago were not saying, today I had these thoughts about blah blah blah. They were telling a story, like maybe it was about a hunt, or maybe it was about like a battle between the two tribes, or about the anger of the gods, but there had to be some story. And I think if there's not a real story at the core, it tends to seem a little bit masturbatory to me. So I became more and more interested, and ultimately I think there was also a degree of snobbery in me when I was a younger writer, because I wasn't very good with story. I didn't know how to do it, and so that's why I dismissed it, because story is something that I don't think any writer, or at least very, very few writers, are born with an instinct of how to do it. You might be born, there are certain poets who are wonderful poets at a very young age, but there are very few narrative prodigies, because it's a craft, and you really have to learn how to put together a story, and it takes a long time, I think, and it's difficult. So I became more and more interested in this, and one of the things, when I got those rejection letters from all these publishers for that second book, and when I read them, there was actually a common theme in many of them, which is that we like the writing and we like the dialogue, but the story, there isn't really much of a story. There's not much of a backbone to this narrative that you're telling, and they were right. They were really right about that. And so when I came up with the idea for 25th Hour, part of the reason I was drawn to that story was it takes place in a very compressed time frame, and it's all basically over the course of the last night of Monty Bergen's freedom, and because it was set in this one night, or one day, but mostly the one night, it sort of forced me to concentrate on story, because it wasn't, as opposed to telling a story that takes place over 30 years, or writing a novel that takes place over 30 years. It was all happening at once, and it really it kind of imposed a certain structure onto the book that I was having a hard time to find before. So yes, again, very long-winded answer.
Do you still hope that one day you'll write the perfect novel or the perfect movie, or do you see yourself as a person who will do this work for a lot of years to come? Or do you
I hope.
Do you think that you will be released someday when you do from a
compulsion
perfect
to write? Yeah, I mean, I'd like to say no, because it sounds kind of ridiculous, but yeah, I think I always do hope that someday I'll write the perfect book, or the one that I know is the one that I know will last. I mean, I think every writer hopes for that, for something that's going to last beyond his or her life, and but the truth is, you never know. I mean, as much as I'd like to think that I'm going to write something, whether a novel or a script, that's kind of perfect, the truth is, even though it's impossible, and B, you would never know if you wrote it, because as the poet John Berryman said, you never know if the writing's any good. You go to your grave not knowing. And you look at the American poets of the 19th century who in their day were considered the great geniuses, and they're almost all forgotten now. And Emily Dickinson, who was completely unknown, is considered the great poet of her time. So who knows? Who knows how future generations will view anything. But yes, I think I remain this eternal optimist that someday I'm going to write something that's going to be like this shining tome that will, 500 years from now people will be reading, and it's very unlikely that it will happen, but I remain an optimist.
Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you.